Good morning. It is so good to be here with you this morning to get to study another portion of God's Word together. If you're visiting with us, we are honored that you're here, and we are excited that you came and joined us as we look through the Beatitudes. We've been looking for a few weeks, looking through Matthew chapter 5, and if you have your Bibles, I'd encourage you to open those there. This is really the preamble to one of Jesus' most famous sermons, Matthew 5, Matthew 6, into portions of Matthew 7. Jesus is teaching this great lesson that really constitutes a lot of things. But he starts with what we know as the Beatitudes, and they're called that because as the Bible was compiled over time, they became referenced as the blessings verses, because Jesus talks about blessed are those, and then these are the Beatitudes. And as it was being translated in Latin, that's where beato, that's the Latin word for blessed. And so people over time became calling these the blessed verses, and we're going to look through these in Matthew 5. If you were here last few weeks, then we've looked at two really incredible sections of this as we start in Matthew 5. And I'll go ahead and tell you, I encourage you to also flip to Psalm 37, 37th Psalm. If you want to keep a finger there, we'll flip back and forth this morning. But Jesus is talking, Sermon on the Mount, and it says he opens his mouth and taught them, blessed are the poor in spirit. So that was week one. And all that really means, of course, if you look at the Greek, the word poor there just means destitute. It means we have nothing. The poor in spirit are those that recognize that we have nothing apart from Christ. And then he gives the spiritual blessing. He says, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Last week we talked about blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And that's a tough one for us to reconcile. How can we be comforted and mourning at the same time? We looked last week at how God is able to work those simultaneously. This week's another great one, but one that really gets a lot of questions, and so we're going to approach this differently. We're going to look at Matthew 5 and verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. We're going to tackle this two ways. We're going to start by looking at what it means to be meek, because that's a word, that's a concept that I'm fearful has gotten lost currently in our current cultural context. If anyone knows what it means, it's considered a bad thing. Right, being meek, it means being weak. It means that we aren't pursuing the things we should be. Meekness is not something that our culture is pointing us to. So we've lost some of the understanding of even what Christ would have meant by the idea of meekness. And then we're going to transition into the second portion of this, for they shall inherit the earth. There's been a lot of teaching of that over the years that points probably into an incorrect direction. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a profile, if you want to think of it that way. We're going to do what's called a character study or a trait study, where we're going to spend this entire time defining what it means to be meek. Obviously, we've looked every week. I've given you these two slides, two things that we point to in the Beatitudes. Christ shows us that where true happiness can be found. And he says, blessed are those, and then he fills in the blank. Blessed are those that are poor in spirit. Blessed are those that are meek. Blessed are those that mourn. And again, that word blessed it really doesn't mean happy. It's kind of a tough word to translate out of the Greek. It means eternally happy. It's even beyond what joy is. It means if you are one and connected to the Father, then in time, the joy will be there, right? That's really what the more literal understanding of blessed means. But then it also shows us the potential that's found in Christ. That's the ending of all of these, right? For theirs is the kingdom of heaven, for they shall be comforted. But then you get down to verse 5, and you might think, well, Keaton, I see two very clear spiritual blessings, right? The kingdom of heaven, being comforted. But now it's starting to talk about inheriting the earth. We're going to go into Psalm 37, and we'll dissect that together. So we're going to build a profile for what it means to be meek. We're going to do a character study of that, and then we're going to tackle the latter portion of this. So look in Psalm 37. We're going to spend a portion of our time together in Psalm 37, because this is undoubtedly what Jesus was referencing back to. The language is almost identical. If the best that we can translate Hebrew over into Greek, some of the words are almost exact. So when we see Jesus talking about blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, Psalm 37 and verse 11. Now Psalm 37 is a little bit of a background. We just did a Sunday evening series looking through the Psalms. This is a psalm that David wrote. It tells us that kind of in the introduction here. But it says Psalm 37 verse 11, but the meek shall inherit the land. Now, that's an important notation there. When we translate the word land or earth, both in Hebrew as well in Greek, it means a couple things. It can mean land or dirt, or it can mean earth in terms of our world. Now, the Greek, most of the translators for the New Testament, we're looking at Matthew 5 and verse 5, translates this into earth. And it points us to this idea of the world. But it really is much more akin to Psalm 37, which means the land. And what David is really illustrating in Psalm 37 is reminding the people of God's promises. God had been promising the Jews and saying, listen, if you'll follow me, this is what you stand to inherit. So all that David is reminding them of here is, but the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundance and peace. If you look at really the verses before and even the verse after this is all talking about God's promise, that if you follow in what God asks you to do, this is the reward that you stand to gain. And we're going to build some of our profile on meekness looking through Psalm 37, and then we'll use the latter portion of this to help us address the portion there. Psalm 37:9, but those who wait on the Lord shall inherit the land. The meek shall inherit the land. If you look Psalm 37 and verse 9, the evildoer shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord will inherit this. The meek shall inherit this. You can connect these two ideas, and we understand the first principle of what does it mean to be meek. It tells us that the meek are those that wait on God. What does that mean? Let's define what this means, what it means to wait on God as we kind of look through this. I think Psalm 37, 5 through 8 defines this for us. We kind of have to reorganize this a little bit, but again, most of the verses here were placed by the translators, but if we look kind of backwards and forwards, we find a very clear definition of what it means to be meek. Psalm 37, 5 through 8 says, commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will act. He will bring forth your righteousness as the light, your justice as the noonday. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil devices. Refrain from anger, forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil. Friends, I'm going to suggest to you that this is a beautiful, not exhaustive, but beautiful start to defining what it means to be meek. David is writing and really giving us some great things. So we're going to use Psalm 37, 5 through 8, and a few other verses to help us build our definition for what it means to wait on God, what it means to be meek. Because as Christ points us to, blessed are those who are meek. David says, blessed are those who are meek. Those will be the ones that inherit the land. Jesus says they will inherit the earth, which again, we're pretty confident is pointing us to this idea of God will fulfill his promises for those who follow him. So clearly, even though meekness has fallen by the wayside in our current cultural context, this is a significant thing for Christ. This is a significant thing for the Father, for us to understand what it means to be meek. So let's look at a portrait of what it means to be meek together. First is they trust in God. As we define how we place what it means to be meek, the meek place their ultimate trust in the Father. Look in 37 and verse 5. Commit your way to the Lord. The word way there in the Hebrew really is much larger than just path. But it literally means your essence, everything, your spirit, all the things that you have to offer. So it's not just commit your plans, and that's sometimes how we interpret this, but it's really saying commit your soul, commit your everything to God. Trust in him, and that's a real contingency here within Psalm 37, and really is a pivotal understanding of what it means to be meek. Meek does not mean weak. Meek does not mean that we roll over and play dead. Meek does not mean passive. Meek means that we are replacing who should be doing the defending. Meek does not mean that we're not going to defend our faith. Meek doesn't mean that we're lazy. But you notice that Psalm 37, we're going to look in a little bit in the book of James, but Psalm 37 is pointing us to this idea, be still and wait before God. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in the way, over the man who carries out evil devices, because it's going to go on to say that God is going to deal with them in his time. So the meek are not just disregarding injustice. The meek are not disregarding insult. The meek are not just sidestepping oppression. The meek have the wisdom to understand that it's not our place to enact the judgment. The meek are those that have the strength to stand aside and say, they'll get what's coming in God's timing. That's what David's reminding us of, and that's what Christ is pointing us back to. Biblical meekness is rooted in the confidence, the deep confidence that God is for you and not against you. That is what verse 5 is pointing us. Commit your way to God. Trust in Him. He will act. I think it's a reminder that we need to give every time we discuss God and His timing, because it may not happen in the timeline that we're wanting. It may not happen when we think it should happen, but it will happen. We talked about this last week. We talked about mourning. God will deliver. That if God promises to do something, He will do it. It might be in judgment that it happens, meaning that we won't see the reconciliation of that on this side of eternity. And friends, we have to be okay with that. We have to be okay with that. And David is pointing them, say, don't worry about this. This is really a passage also on how we handle fear and worry, because he's saying it's not ours to worry about. That God, refrain from anger, forsake wrath, fret not yourself. And notice this, our society needs to hear this more often. It tends only to evil. We talked about this in December when we thought about worry and fear, that this is that Satan would love us to just constantly be in a state of worry, because that breeds other things. Portrait of meekness, they trust in God. Number 2, they commit their way to God. Not only are they trusting, but trusting in God and committing our path, or committing our plans, really are two parts of an equation. But they are separate actions that we have to take. I read it this way. The Hebrew word for commit literally means to roll. Now, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, and I'd never read this before, but it's fascinating. The Hebrew word for commit literally means roll. Meek people have discovered that God is trustworthy and say they roll their way. Now, listen to this. Their business, their problems, their relationships, their health, their fear, their frustrations, they roll it onto the Lord. They admit that they are insufficient to cope with the complexities and pressures and obstacles alone. They trust that God is able and willing to sustain and guide and protect them through it. That's what commit means. We're not sidestepping anything. We're not choosing not to address things. We're just recognizing that there is somebody infinitely more capable of handling our issues than me. And we're rolling it at their feet and saying, Lord, please pick this up. And we trust that He will. We trust in God, but more than that, we commit our way to Him. Meek people are quiet before God and wait on His timing. We trust in God, we commit our ways to Him, and then we quietly wait for Him to act. Let's look in verse 7. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in the way, over the man who carries out evil devices. Friends, this is a reminder that we constantly need to think of. Are we waiting patiently on God? God's timing is so perfect. And we oftentimes look and we're frustrated because we look out into our world and we have expectations and we're human, we're going to do that. Right? We have desires. We take things to God and we say, God, we think we've got it figured out. Lord, this is what I need. Here's the timing that I need it in. This is, if you'll just execute A, B, and C, life is going to be great. But more often than not, God is looking at a grander plan that you and I couldn't possibly fathom. God is weaving together my plan and your plan, and He's weaving it all together for His greater good. We look in the New Testament, we say all things work together for the goodness of God. That is God working behind the scenes. Be still and wait patiently for Him. The meek don't fret over the wicked. The meek don't fret over the wicked. Let's reread this. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way. And this is something that we constantly are thinking of. I hear this at least every other week, if not weekly. A frustration, and I share it. We go out into our world, we go out into the office, we go to school, and we see folks that we know don't love God, and we see them prospering on this side of eternity, and it's frustrating, and we take that to God and say, Lord, why is it I'm suffering, I'm going through this time, but somebody else over here who doesn't love you, who's not following in your way, they seem to be doing well. And this is what David is pointing. He says, fret not. We could probably spend a whole nother sermon on just what that word fret really means. But he's saying, don't concern yourself with that because it's essentially already handled. He's saying, don't worry about it because Dad, Father, Abba, God, has already planned this accordingly. It looks as if they've got it all together, but David is saying it's a house of cards. He's saying it will get knocked down in the appropriate time. Fret not over the one who prospers, over the man who carries out evil devices. They don't fret over the wicked. Look in Numbers chapter 12. I think a perfect illustration of meekness as we begin to develop our understanding is looking at what Moses does in Numbers 12. Lots of examples we could have pulled from, but Numbers 12, 1 through 4 is a situation where Miriam and Aaron come before Moses, and they begin to mock him. And I want you to notice the way Moses responds, or really doesn't respond. Let's read these few verses together, and then I encourage you to read the following verses, because after this, God makes it very apparent that Moses is his man. Moses did it correctly. But look at Numbers 12, 1 through 4. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because the Cushite woman who he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman, they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? The Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very meek, more than all men that were on the face of the earth. And suddenly the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron and to Miriam, come out you three in the tent of meeting. Now, again, in the moment, in the face of opposition, Moses could have flown off the handle. He could have responded. He could have yelled. He could have gotten angry. How dare you say it? He's doing exactly what God would have him to do. But if you read all the following verses, which we don't have time for, in Numbers 12, you recognize that they all go out before the Lord, and God completely vindicates Moses. God completely says, no. This is my servant who is doing my will, and he's doing the things that I have asked him to do. Moses, in his meekness, understood that part of being a follower of God is sidestepping some of the opposition and recognizing that God will handle it in his timing. And that's exactly what he does here. In God's timing, he addresses Miriam, he addresses Aaron, and he gives Moses the confidence to continue in the plan that God had laid out. This is a perfect illustration of how meekness is applied in most of our lives. Again, it's not weakness. It's not passive. It's not lazy. It's not an inability to act. It is the wisdom to act in the appropriate time with the one who actually matters. Because truthfully, you and I could enact our version of justice, and it's really not worth much at all. But at the end of the day, God is the one who will address appropriately. He will punish. He will separate the sheep and the goats together. Meekness means committing your cause to God and not needing to defend yourself. Not that you're unable, not that you wouldn't be willing, but recognizing that it's not the right position at that time. Many times as Christians, this is where we find ourselves. That's exactly where Moses found himself. I'd argue to you that meekness is a prime characteristic that Jesus portrayed while he was here on this earth, right? When he was standing before knowing that he was sinless, but recognizing that God had bigger plans, recognizing that he had a job to do. Look with me in James chapter 1. James 1 is a really amazing New Testament text that points us to some of the qualifications, some of the characteristics, I think, of meekness, helps us round out our understanding. It says, know this, my beloved brethren, let every man be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not work the righteousness of God. Therefore, put away all filthiness and rank growth of wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. Friends, do you recognize the correlation that James places upon our understanding of meekness and our salvation? He's saying that through the understanding, through the characteristic of meekness, which as we've already been looking, it's not weakness. It's understanding that God is going to act in a bigger and better time. And this is what James is saying. He's saying with the meekness of God's word, we are able to receive the benefit, the salvation. Because all of this is understanding that God is going to work in his timing. That God, through his grace, gave us Christ. We're able to be baptized. And then God's going to come back and collect us when he's ready. That God is going to come back and separate the sheep and the goats on his time. That you and I might be persecuted on this side of eternity, waiting on the Father. Part of accepting that is meekness. The apostles understood this in varying degrees, some of them better than others, but Christ certainly did. Therefore, put away filthiness and rank growth and receive with meekness the implanted word. I read it one way, that meekness is the power to absorb adversity and criticism without lashing back. Think about it. Meekness is the ability, it's the power. Again, meekness in many ways is the opposite of weakness. It's the opposite of reactionary. It's the opposite of a lot of the negative characteristics and adjectives that the world would place on it. It's really the other way. It's the power to absorb that and say, I don't have any need to get angry. I'm going to go back to James 1. I'm able to be quick to hear. I'm able to maintain slow to speak, slow to anger. I'm able to maintain the righteousness of the Father because I recognize that my Father that has a salvation to offer to me will handle this in the appropriate time. Meekness is the power to absorb adversity and criticism without lashing back. Meekness is, as we continue to round out our understanding, meekness is teachable, meaning that you and I are able and willing to be taught and to grow. Look in James 1, and I want to just emphasize a few things here. Know this, my beloved brethren, let every man be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. This is something that we often need reminding of. Are we quick to hear? Do we listen more than we speak, or is it the other way around? Are we quick to lash out when we're frustrated? Are we quick to lash out when we feel hurt? Are we quick to lash out when we're frustrated? Are we slow to speak, slow to anger? Meekness doesn't mean that we have an absence of passion or conviction. I'm going to suggest to you that it takes passion and conviction to be meek. It takes passion and conviction. It takes zeal. It takes a fire in your belly to have the conviction and the faith to say that I'm so secure in who holds my eternity that I don't have a need to be angry because of what others might say. I don't have a need to lash back out. I don't have a need to get angry because I'm aware that the judgment is going to happen in a broader scale, in a bigger way than anything that I could offer. And it's going to be perfect, and I will be vindicated the way that Moses was. It doesn't mean that we have an absence of passion or conviction. Meekness begins with God, and it ends with God. It starts with an understanding that I belong to the one who created me. I belong to the one who created you, that created the world that we live in, and it's going to end there. When God comes and separates the sheep and the goats and he collects his children to come home with him, the meekness is understanding that everything will happen and will be squared away in that time frame. Which then transitions us into the latter portion. This is where you've probably heard folks talk about this in a variety of ways. For they shall inherit the earth, Matthew 5 and verse 5. Proponents of new earth, new heaven, theories such as that point to verses like this. But I want to point to a broader understanding of what this really means. Because the Sermon on the Mount is about the kingdom. The Sermon on the Mount, and again, this is where we have to understand and put on our Bible student hats for a moment, just briefly. But we have to understand the broader context. Because if you just read that out of context, oh yeah, so we get to inherit the earth. And there are many that would love to teach that means that, of course, when Christ comes back, that we're going to repopulate the earth and that the earth is heaven's going to come to, that's the new earth, new heaven theory. But again, look at this in broader context, what Jesus is really talking about. In the Beatitudes, he's talking about all of these kingdom principles. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Again, blessed are those who fulfill this. This is the spiritual reward. They will receive the kingdom of heaven. They will be comforted. Again, just excluding meekness for a moment. They will obtain righteousness. They shall receive mercy. They shall see God. They shall be called sons of God. For their sake, the kingdom of heaven is theirs. But then the Sermon on the Mount goes on to talk about what it means to be salt and light. Jesus talks about what it means to have great relationships. He goes on in 43 to talk about love your enemies. Love the ones that persecute you the way that the Father loves you. Because ultimately, that's what's going to get you to heaven. He talks about giving to the needy. He gives us the example of the Lord's Prayer. He talks about lay up your treasures in heaven. He says that everything we position here on this side of eternity, look over in Matthew 6, starting in verse 19. He says, don't lay up for yourself treasures in earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up yourselves treasures in heaven. The Sermon on the Mount is all about heaven. Why in the world would Jesus give all of these spiritual blessings, but then those that are meek somehow get the short straw and they just inherit the earth? Jesus is heralding us back to Psalm 37. And again, understand what David was doing there. David was talking to Israel, and he was saying, listen, this is a reminder that if we do the things God has asked of us, he will fulfill his promise. He gave us the land. He's given us this promise here. He's given us the land. And Jesus is saying essentially the same thing. He's saying, listen, if you fulfill the promise of the Father, if you guide your life after him, he will fulfill the promises that he's given you. And the promises that he's given to us is that if we're baptized into his Son, then we're called children of God, and we will come and spend an eternity in heaven with him. That's the promise. This is not about earth. This is not about land. This is about promises. This is about God fulfilling what he said he would. He did it to the Israelites in the Old Testament, and he's still doing it for us today. Jesus has been preaching, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. If you look at even Matthew 3, Matthew 4, the chapters leading up to the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking multiple times in kind of increasing frequency. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heaven is coming. Right, that is ultimately one of Jesus' grandest messages is heaven is coming. Are you ready? And he wants them to understand that through the Beatitudes as well. Trust in the Lord, do good, dwell in the land. That's part of this promise that David's talking about, and befriend faithfulness. The psalmist, David, was using the earth as a metaphor to assure them that they would have all the promises that God made if they fall in line. Jesus used the same inherit the earth. It's almost the exact same language to assure his disciples, to assure us that we would enjoy the same spiritual blessings if we follow in God's footsteps. Friends, the promise is very clear. As we look at the Beatitudes, what an amazing promise. Blessed are the meek. I hope you understand meekness is not weakness. Meekness is not lethargy. Meekness is not laziness. Meekness is not any of the things that the earth, that people would point it to. In fact, it is a strength all its own. It's a faithfulness all its own. It's a power all its own to look and recognize and say, I am secure in the one who holds my tomorrow. I can wake up in the morning because I know who holds that day. This morning, if you're not a Christian, we want to extend that invitation to you. What a great opportunity it is to look and recognize that God did make us promises. He said, if you come into my Son, if you come in contact with the blood of my Son, you become my child, and I will bring my children back with me in heaven one day. That's a promise that we have opportunity to access today. If you've never put on Christ in baptism, we wish to extend that invitation to you. Why wait? Maybe you just need prayers or support in some way. We'd love to help you with that as well. If we can do anything for you this morning, would you come let us know about it as we stand and as we sing together?